But so Dr. Sartin is a professor in the Department of Anatomy, Physiology, and Pharmacology. He actually did his bachelor's and master's at Auburn and returned back there, and I won't say when he returned back there, but he's of course is our president of our American Society of Animal Science right now, finishing up this year, and he's been editor for several different journals, numerous funding, very well funded throughout his career through USDA, NIH, Navy, several different contracts. So it's just a real honor to have Dr. Sartin here with us today. So thank you very much. I'm just going to go on and let you get started. And he's going to be talking to us today on a little bit different of a topic. So it's not one of our usual research seminars. So it's going to be surviving the review process and editor's perspective. So thank you, Dr. Sartin.
So I see some people with hair about as gray as mine, so just so you know, this is oriented toward the students who don't have any publishing background. So you can nod off, I won't hold it against you. I might call you out in 2 minutes. So what I'm going to do for the students, I want to start and very generally go through the parts of a paper, and I'll sort of half read this to you because you pretty much know what they are anyway. And then I want to go back behind the scenes and show you or talk to you about how I would do things as an editor, how I might make decisions, choose reviewers, and that kind of thing. So, just to start, I think one of the first things you might do is ask yourself, should you even write a paper? And I just made a general list of things. And I don't think this pointer works very well, but do you have a novel and innovative hypothesis? Does your data provide new information to the scientific literature? And this is probably the linchpin question to ask yourself. Am I generating new data into the scientific literature? Is your paper descriptive or mechanistic, which would dictate probably the quality of the journal you end up publishing in? Is your experimental design adequate for the type of question you've asked? Are your statistics appropriate? And finally, are your conclusions consistent with your data and your starting hypothesis? So let's assume that you're more or less positive on these questions. The next thing to do is choose a journal. And I put a picture of the cover of the journal that I edited for about 25 years, just to give you some clue of how long I've been doing this stuff. So one of the first questions is the scope of your paper versus the subject matter being appropriate to this particular journal. So if you're looking at gray squirrel and nutrition, this is probably not the place for you to go. So once you determine what journal you want to publish in, after you've made sure that your paper will fit in with their topic matter, another thing you might consider is a scientific impact factor for that journal. I don't really know that I can stand here and tell you that scientific impact factor is a really good discriminator. So if your journal, well, let me just say this. This is from the animal science category in 2003. And you can see the highest ranking journal had a scientific impact factor of 2.7 and the lowest of 0.01. So I would probably tell you that the top 5 or 10 journals in this category, you can't really discriminate very well on scientific impact factor. But I can tell you, if you're looking at the top rated journals in this field, compared to this dude at the bottom with a 0.01, I can tell you the 0.01 journal is one that people aren't reading and people aren't citing. So you're probably better off being in the top part of this category than in the bottom part. There are some other reasons to pay attention to scientific impact factor. A lot of places I go now, I find that the universities are requiring you to indicate scientific impact factor when you go up for tenure and promotion. Some granting agencies require that your journals on your own CV have a 2.0 or higher, or they won't pay attention to them. There are some countries where funding for universities is based on the scientific impact factor of the journals by the faculty. And there are other places, China being one of the notable ones, where you can get bonuses to your salary for the higher impact journals. So practical value in there as well. Once you've decided where to go, I have these little notes down here, and I may or may not point them out, but this one is critical. Get the instructions to authors and follow them very closely. Because if you don't, they don't have to review your journal, your article. Well, the first thing in a manuscript is a title, right? And people tend not to pay attention to titles when they're writing very much. And it's really an important issue that you do pay attention, because when you do a literature search, what do you get? You get a list of titles, right? And so as a student or a researcher, you're going down the list of titles saying, okay, which one of these interests me? And so what you want is a title that's informative, but you want to attract attention to it. And I have two titles up here. The bottom one was actually the one I was working on, the effect of beauty-related protein on feed intake in sheep. But I was sending this to a rat journal, Neuroendocrinology, and I was also going to present this paper at the Endocrine Society meetings, which is a very rat, human-centric journal. And so if they saw sheep on the title, they would come by and go, oh, yeah, and keep on walking, right? I wanted them to stop. So what I chose in the end was the upper title, Role for a Beauty-Related Protein in Appetite Regulation in a Species with Continuous Nutrient Delivery. It says the same thing, right? I just described a grazing animal or ruminant to these guys without using the word sheep. So when I went to the Endocrine Society meeting, instead of walking by my paper, they stopped and said, wow, that's a really clever model. Which wasn't what it was at all. It was just a really clever title. But I chose my title based on the need to get people to stop and read my paper, which is what I wanted them to do. Pay attention to your title, because it's going to be one of the early discriminators of whether people read your paper or not. The next thing is to select authors. So right now, as a graduate student, probably your major professor is going to do the author selecting for you. But I put a couple of things that you might consider when it's your turn to make this decision. So do they have a major role in, say, helping you collect samples or doing something with your research? Or maybe they had some intellectual role that was indispensable. Or maybe they gave you a technique that you absolutely had to have to do this paper. Maybe they were the statistician on your paper. Now, let me give you an example. I had a young assistant professor who came to me and he said, I have this student, I want to do this particular project, but I can't do it in my lab. I don't have the reagents, the supplies, nothing. So I took the student, we showed her how to do everything, we paid for it, we made sure that everything worked, and when the paper came out, my name was nowhere on there. I was never asked if I wanted to be. Now, I'm not going to hold it against the kid, but there are people who would. So I think it bears some effort in making sure that people that deserve to be on there get included on a paper. Now, you're probably aware in some labs do it differently. So in my son's, when he did his PhD, it was a major professor and the student, and nobody else. And in other labs, you'll see everybody in the lab and the technician is on there too. So you'll have to develop your own mechanism. But remember to give it serious consideration. The next thing on the paper is an abstract, right? Here you're basically describing in a short 250 words everything that you did. Hypothesis, methods, results, and some sort of take-home statement. But a lot of people just say, oh, I've got to do it in 250 words and slam it together. Do you remember that list of titles we had a minute ago? We go through and find that list of titles, click on the title, and where does it take us? It takes us to an abstract. And people read that abstract and make the determination whether they go and actually look at your paper or not. And the goal is for them to read your paper, right? So pay attention to the abstract and make sure you've written it well. The next part is the introduction. So here you have a logical series of paragraphs where you're trying to convince the reader or reviewer that your paper is a good one, that you have a good hypothesis. And the way I liken it is when you made the decision for your hypothesis, you started with a broad base of the scientific literature, and then you focus it down to your hypothesis. And when you write your introduction, in a sense, that's the same thing you're doing, is distilling all of that information for the reviewer. You're setting up the conditions for your hypothesis, and you're selling your paper. Because if you can't sell it here, that reviewer is going to go through with a biased look at the rest of your paper. Materials and methods. When you write the materials and methods, really you're telling us everything you did, but keep in mind a couple of things. One, the reviewer is trying to get a snapshot in his mind of your experimental design and what you've done. And if he can't understand it, he's not going to be favorable for your review. The other thing you have to remember that as a scientist, I may pick up your paper and go, wow, this is a really cool thing they did. I'm going to incorporate it in my research. But what if I can't figure out exactly how you did it because you left a few details out? I try to replicate your work and come up with a different data set. Then I write my paper and say, you don't know what you're talking about and your mother doesn't like you, right? You don't want that to happen. So make sure you give people enough data or enough information that they can follow what we've done. The results section is just an objective statement of the things that came out of your study. But you do have to spend some time choosing the format in which you're going to present your data. So you may have some huge data set and you want to put it in tables. I really hate tables because that makes me have to work too hard because I have to look at all the numbers and figure out what it's trying to say to me. Kind of simple, and I like pretty pictures. So for me, they're better. But if you have a really well-constructed figure with a really nice figure legend, I should be able to look at that and intuitively understand everything that you've done. I put this in here just because it's one of my new pet peeves, is we see a lot of papers where people talk about trends. So they'll say there was a trend for the number to go up, p less than 0.07, but nowhere in the methods did they tell me they were going to use a trend or what they considered a trend to be. So if you don't define it for me and I see it, I'm going to make you take every bit of that out and rewrite your paper. The other thing is, for a results section that's not a combined results and discussion, make sure you don't discuss your data. Just present it in an objective manner. The discussion is the coolest part of the paper to me because this is where you tell the reviewer and the readers what your data means. This is where you indicate somewhere in there whether you answered your hypothesis that you started, so it draws your paper back together. You should also tell us in there how your data has advanced scientific knowledge. This is an important part for this. Has your data advanced scientific knowledge and put it into the context of the data in your field? Somebody was mentioning at lunch about master's thesis or dissertation. You could always tell when it went into a paper that it was a dissertation. One of the reasons is you tend to speculate too much in a dissertation, and in a research paper you need to confine what you're talking about to what your data tells you. So try not to speculate too much. At the end, you want some sort of concise summary or some kind of conclusion. So remember, in today's society, we work on about a 30-second soundbite. And so I may not remember your paper, but if you give me a take-home message about why your paper is important, I might tend to remember that. So it's a good idea to have something like that at the end. The last thing are the references, and you should cite relevant references in your field. Make sure you check with the journal because some journals will say no more than 60 references, but you can get an idea from other papers how many references are more or less acceptable for that particular journal. One thing to make sure you always do is check the journal style for listing references because that's an easy thing for reviewers to check, and they all do it and they'll make you go back and fix it if you're wrong. Make sure the information you cite is correct. So I'm a reviewer, right, and you've got some method that you're using and I want to go look it up and I can't find it because you made a mistake in your references. Or worse, my scientific impact factor is going to be dependent on you citing me, and if you miscite me, I may not get credit. Another thing, and this is a little bit of a strange one, but make sure you use recent references. I reviewed a paper, I think the year was about 2005 for the American Journal of Physiology. And it was a paper on signal transduction. And the most recent reference in that manuscript was 1998. So I'm sitting here thinking, he got this paper rejected and he's just now pulling it out of the shelf and dusted it off and sent it back. But between 1998 and 2005, there was a huge explosion in data and information, new concepts in signal transduction. And we had to force this guy to rewrite his paper to bring it up to date to show us where his paper fit within our current thinking. So make sure everything is up to date. That doesn't mean that you don't want a historical perspective, right? Because those are important as well. Okay, I said I'd go kind of fast through this because you have a little intuitive knowledge. Now what I want to do is try to go a little bit behind the scenes and talk to you about things that need to be thought about as you're putting your paper together, and talk to you about how we would manage a manuscript. So the first thing is, in the old days we did cover letters. We don't have to do them anymore, but we have an electronic equivalent of a cover letter. And there are a couple of things that we make sure is in there. One is you indicate, the top line indicate you're not submitting to another journal at the same time. So it is not ethical to submit a paper to two different journals. I had a paper come in one time, sent it out to the reviewers. A week later, I get a call from one of the reviewers. He had just gotten the same paper from another journal. So now we have two different editors, two different staffs, two different sets of reviewers working on the same paper, but only one of us is going to end up publishing that paper. So the two editors got together and we discussed what we wanted to do. And our decision was, of course, to reject this manuscript. And we also wrote this guy and told him why this was unethical behavior, and we banned him from publishing in either journal for a period of 3 years. That's pretty tough on this guy who happened to be an assistant professor. It's a really the wrong time to screw up. Another thing is that you need to make sure that all authors have read and approved this manuscript. So in other words, if you put my name on your paper, you are borrowing my reputation, and I don't want you to misuse it. What happens if you submit a paper and put my name on it and I haven't given you permission? I had a kid do this, PhD student, beautiful paper, almost no errors in it. It went out for review and we came back and sent it back to him with an accept with minor revision. Really good paper. Within a week I got a phone call from one of the co-authors, and the guy said, "Do not publish this paper. I have just seen it for the first time. I did not approve my name being on there. I'm submitting this to the department head, to the dean, and to the dean of the graduate school, and I'm charging this PhD student with scientific misconduct. I want his PhD taken away, so he cannot get his PhD degree." So months later, after a faculty committee gets through with this, that's not what they did. They let him get his PhD degree, but they put a letter in his permanent file. What I'm trying to say is you can get in big trouble for putting someone's name on a paper without their approval, right? Don't do it. One thing you can do when you submit your papers is a lot of journals will allow you to suggest reviewers. Now remember, if I'm an editor, right, I have a faculty job by day where I have to do research and teach and all of those other things that you have to do. So I'm doing this on the side. If you want me to use your reviewers, don't just give me a list of names. Give me the contact information so I don't have to go look them up, which is another sense. I won't go look them up if you don't give it to me. Tough. The other thing you can do is a lot of journals will allow you to specify reviewers that should not see your paper. So there may be someone out there with a conflict of interest. For instance, there may be two labs that are working in exactly the same field and they're competing. There may be a conflict of interest to be a reviewer on your paper. Another situation, and one that I had, was there was a technique for measuring a hormone. And this guy has come up with a new method of assaying this hormone. He didn't want the original discoverer of the old assay to review his paper. He felt there could be a conflict of interest. So you have both of these options. I have to tell you, on suggesting reviewers, every time I've ever suggested reviewers, I've had more trouble getting published than when I just took their random reviewers. I think sometimes because your mentors and friends hold you to a higher standard than maybe the general scientific community might. But I don't do that anymore just because I've had such bad luck. Either way, we do not just use unknown reviewers. I'm going to show you in a minute how we go about checking reviewers and what kind of things we look for. Okay, so this is the main menu for an Elsevier journal. So Elsevier has the same thing for every one of their journals, which might make sense, right? Because it's cheap to pass it along. And so if I look through this to-do menu, some of these things are colored, which means I have active links and I can go do something. So I might have a new assignment, so I can click that on and look at the paper, look at whatever the authors may have told me about that paper. But I also go to reviewer selection screen. So this is what it looks like. And if I could jump that high, I would go to that second bulleted point, I want to show you that it says that submissions will move to the submissions complete folder as soon as 2 reviews come in. So what is typically done is 5 reviews are requested, and you take the first 2 back. If they disagree, you have another 3 to pull from. Now, I don't let those poor guys waste all their time. I'll write them and say, if you want your review to count, you better get it in by Friday or I'm deciding without you. I say it a lot nicer than that, but that's... So we're trying to keep the review process going quickly. I might add to you, because you're going to be in one day a position to review manuscripts, one of the biggest problems we have, scientists want their papers reviewed quickly, but when they're reviewers themselves, they either won't review the paper or they put it on a shelf and come back a month later. And these are the biggest whiners when it comes to their own papers. So when we come down to the bottom, this is where we can search for reviewers. So I can go and search, stick in a name that I know as a possible reviewer, and it'll look at all the reviewers in our database and pull those up, and I can ask them to review the paper. I can suggest reviewers, which means I'm going to submit new reviewers to this system. Or you put in a series of keywords, and I match those keywords up against the keywords provided by reviewers. So all of these are possible mechanisms we can get to a group of reviewers for your paper. Now, if I don't know those reviewers, I'm going to check on them. So I want to know, are they publishing in the field that your manuscript is in? Are they current on what they're doing? Do other people cite their work, or are they, nobody pays any attention to them, maybe they're not such a good reviewer? And finally, and especially if you submitted a name to me, I'm going to look on the list of authors and go, I wonder if this is his cousin's uncle's nephew's college roommate, just in case you've seen Mel Brooks movies. So I'm going to make sure it wasn't the postdoc who just graduated from your laboratory and he's your good buddy and you're hoping for an easy review. As a postdoc, my postdoctoral advisor was reviewing a paper, and the editor was in another part of our medical school, and so he gave me this review he did, and he left it open, so I had to peek, right? It's unethical of me, but I did it anyway. And it was from an old postdoc coming out of our lab, and my boss had rejected his manuscript because he didn't think it stood up to the lab's standards. So you never know. So anyway, the 2 places I would typically use are the Web of Knowledge or the National Library of Medicine. And I just put my name into these. This would have been a search from 1945 to 2009. And no, Janet, I wasn't born in 1945. Or no, didn't get my PhD then either. Go ahead. So you can see that the author has at least been cited somewhat. And then this is a Web of Knowledge, just the first pane off of it. So you can see it lists all the papers from this author and the number of times they're cited. And then you can expand these and look at them. Now, if you looked at this recently, you'll notice that this is an old formatting. They have a brand new formatting that gives you more information. So you can look at all the authors on the paper and who's citing it and all that kind of stuff with a quick click of the mouse. But what I did was this old one, you'll notice all of these references. There's 6 different references, all to the American Journal of Physiology. They're all referencing the same paper. So I left it in this old format because it shows you the kind of errors that can creep in here. And one of these mistakes is absolutely not linked to any journal. There's no way you could find this paper if you followed this typographical error. And worse, 3 people, or at least 3 papers, have used the same typographical error, which may mean all too often we go and look at a review article and we grab an article and use it without going back to the original source, which is also a bad thing to do. The other place would be PubMed. And in PubMed, here, this is National Library of Medicine, you can see you get a list of all the authors and all the titles, so I can go down here and quickly see who's publishing with this reviewer. In other words, I'm looking to see if you as a major professor are on here with these guys, or a graduate student, and I can find the topic. So if I wanted a reviewer in appetite control, I might go through here and make sure, oh, here's an appetite paper, this must be an okay reviewer to use in appetite. So these are the kind of questions we ask, and what I'm trying to do is tell you we're not just taking your word for these reviewers, we want to make sure that they're competent in the area they say they're competent in, or that you say they're competent in. Now when we get the reviews back, this is a summary screen I have. you can see I get the recommendation of the reviewer, so publish with revision and reject. And so then I click those in and it opens to a new screen which has comments to the reviewers, candid comments to me in which they tell me whatever they really think. And then there's one other thing, and that is a publication priority score. And so we used a priority score like NIH. So 1, this is a really great paper, you got to publish it, down to 4, which is like, you don't want it to see the light of day, right? And so I can get a paper where the reviewer says publish with revision, but it gives it a priority score of a 3. So in other words, there's nothing really wrong with this paper, but it's not very interesting. And so what most journals do is they look at that publication priority score and come up with some sort of numeric value in there. So if you get published with revision from both guys, both reviewers, but they both give you a 3, you reject the manuscript anyway. Okay? So each journal does it a little bit differently, but they'll all use these publication priority numbers that are outside of this publish or reject. The other thing I want to use this screen for is this is an actual example of a paper. So this guy was published with revision, this guy says reject, and you can see I gave the guys a chance to respond to the reviews. And the reason I did that is this guy's methods were kind of convoluted. And so one of the reviewers said, this could be a really, really good paper, or it could really stink. I cannot tell. And so I gave them a chance to revise. They got it past the reviewer and ultimately got it published. So the editor does have some leeway in this decision-making process. It's not just those numbers. Now, my wife was editor of veterinary pathology while I was an editor, and we would sit in front of the television with our laptops and going, look what this guy. And so we weren't too bad. So what we did was make up some common complaints from reviewers about the manuscripts. And these are in no specific order, but it's the typical kind of things we would see. Paper doesn't add anything new to the scientific literature. That's kind of a kiss of death, right? Because that's why we're here, is to generate new information, right? It's the whole definition of our existence, in a sense. The second one, this paper is fine, but it's just descriptive. So a lot of journals and a lot of reviewers don't want you to just say, hey, there's a difference here, but we want to know why that difference exists. What's happening there to make the difference occur? The difference in a descriptive and a mechanistic paper is a really good journal or an average lower tier journal. If you publish in the biomedical literature, and you're like me and use a non-rat species for your research, if it's new for, say, a sheep, but it's already been done in a rat, you can't publish it in those journals. They don't care. They're after brand new biology, and because it may be new for one species, is irrelevant to them. So endocrinology would be my example. It's been done in a rat, unless it's been done in, if it's been done in a rat and you do it in a human, you can get by with that. But if it's any other species, it has to be something really, really different about those species, or it's not publishable. You would think we wouldn't see this, but results don't prove the stated hypothesis. So they didn't prove or disprove their hypothesis. In fact, you're not really sure what they were doing in the paper. Did not follow instructions to author. As an editor, if you don't follow the instructions to authors, I don't have to review your manuscript. I can reject it and send it back to you. Though I do have this really cool letter I kept from Steve Zinn. He's at the University of Connecticut now, and he wrote me a letter, and it said, so just because you're an editor, you think you're too arrogant to have to follow our instructions to authors. So I've always kept it to remind me that sometimes you think you know what those instructions are, but a new editor changes it the way he wants it, and you need to really follow it. He did not have to review my manuscript. He let it go, with a little gentle chastising. But make sure you follow instructions of authors. It is critical. Animal welfare regulations. I just reviewed a paper for endocrinology a couple of weeks ago. And they have 2 blanks on there relative to animal welfare. One is, are there any animal welfare concerns? If the answer from the reviewer is yes, it is an instant reject. The second question on there is In the methods section, do they state that this protocol was reviewed and approved by the local animal care and use committee? If you say no, it's not in there, the paper goes back to you and you have to revise it without further review. These are very serious things that you have to pay attention to. I can't tell you when I was going through graduate school how many times I got stopped in the hallway by another random professor who wanted to know, what's the hypothesis on your work? And when you stumbled around, they would go after you about it. But we get tons of papers where there's no hypothesis. You're just sitting there going, okay, so why were we doing this paper anyway? You really don't have a basis for reviewing a manuscript without a hypothesis, or at least some stated objective. We see all too often figure legends do not provide sufficient information to allow the reader to understand the figure. Statistics are not appropriate for the experimental design, and that unfortunately has crept upward more and more lately as you can buy a statistical package and you can sleaze through your stats course or not take one and just plug numbers in and something comes out the other end, but it may not be the right thing. Methods are not adequate. I'd say like 6 months ago I rejected a manuscript because they tried to use RT-PCR and talk about quantitative differences in gene expression. Or worse is the guys that buy the real-time PCR machine and use primers, but then they don't sequence the inserts, so they don't know if the primers are really detecting what they think they're looking at or not. Or they don't run milk curves, or they don't use enough housekeeping genes. So a lot of errors in the methods can kill your paper. This one is from my wife specifically because in pathology they use photomicrographs. You'd be surprised at how many times pathologists who live and die on their ability to do diagnosis under a microscope send in pictures that are out of focus. So much so the reviewers can't even tell what tissue they're looking at. And yet somehow they thought that was good enough. I don't know. Then we have the occasional paper that you just look at it and it's like a 6-year-old forgot to take his Ritalin this morning. And it's all over the place. So there'll be a paragraph and the next paragraph is totally unrelated. It's like on a different topic. And so as you stumble through this paper, you have no clue what's going on and you just end up rejecting it. And finally, this is kind of a pet peeve of a lot of the reviewers we see, is that you run into papers where they overstate the significance of their work. Like it's the best thing since the discovery of sliced bread, right? And as soon as you see that, you start looking for the mistakes because it's kind of annoying deep inside somewhere. This is the best ever, you know? You're going, okay, we'll see. Okay, so you sent your reviewers, have gotten this stuff, they sent it back, it comes to you, you read the reviews and you go, those morons, and you throw it down, they don't know what they're talking about, this was a good paper. That's probably not the time to write your response to the reviewers, right? You're laughing. I walked into my wife's office one day, and I knocked on the door, and she usually says, come in or something. I could hear noise, so I kind of peeked to see who she was talking to, and she's sitting there with a phone like this, and I can hear this guy on the other end screaming at her. Those reviewers you gave me didn't know anything. And she goes, I'm sorry, sir, but I think they were doing the best thing. And so she hung up, and I said, you know, I know you're being really nice, but if it were me, I would get on the computer and reject that stupid blankety blanks paper. That's not. Why would you call the editor and cuss him out? This is a guy you want to accept your manuscript, and you're calling him and screaming at him. Not very bright, you would think, but it happens, right? You also don't become antagonistic toward your reviewers, even if they are stupid morons. You have to carefully consider and respond completely to all of their comments. So what you might do, or I'll tell you what I do, is I usually will take and copy the comments the reviewer made or his criticisms, put it into my Word file, and then below with a little space, and I'll go with bold or some way to distinguish it to make sure that it's my responses, I'll say, hey, yeah, I agree with what the reviewer said, and I've made the change. Here's the change I've made, and here's where you can find it in your manuscript. Because, right, remember, these guys are working on the side. They're probably at home doing this instead of doing something they'd rather do. Don't make it hard on them by letting them guess and have to read this whole paper to figure out where your changes were made. So some journals tell you, Wherever you've made a change the color of the font. Or identify by page number and line number where these changes are occurring. Make sure it's easy for them, right? Because you still don't want to antagonize them even by making it hard for them to find your whatever you've done to change the paper. I don't want to leave the impression that you always have to agree with the reviewers. You can disagree with them because they're not always right. You can say, I respectfully disagree, or I disagree with the reviewer's comments, but then tell us why you disagree. Use scientific fact, use logic to show why you were disagreeing with this reviewer's comments. So I wrote a paper a couple years ago where I made a comment about gene expression in the somatotrope. And the reviewer wrote back, no, that's not in this paper, this work has never been done. So in my revision I said, well, I'm pretty sure this is right, I double checked, I've referenced the paper correctly, this is the material. The review comes back to me again, no, this isn't there, you've done this wrong. And so what I did was I downloaded the paper and stuck it in the back of the reviews, and then I copied and pasted the figure and the figure legend and highlighted the key words of gene expression in somatotrope and said, dear sir, I'm sorry, but this is it. You can see that I've referenced it properly. And they let it go. Don't be antagonistic. Be objective and use good science, and you can get past these reviewers, hopefully. The last thing is do not send a paper back without responding to the reviewers. When I first started, I got this paper in, it's by this really famous guy, and I was going, oh, this is so cool, Everybody I see, he's publishing in here, and people will pay attention, and we'll get more great names in here and all that. It's really cool. I sent it off for review, and it comes back with page after page of detailed complaints about this guy's paper. So I said, whoops, maybe it wasn't so good. I sent it back to him, and in a week I get the paper. It's physically not possible, guys. It would have taken me a month to make all these changes. So I take the first one and I start looking through the paper. There's nothing there. I take the second thing and I can't find it. He made none of the changes, but in his response to me, he says, I've made all the responses requested. I rejected his paper, right? Okay, so we all get papers rejected. And after you get through being mad and cussing them out, at some point what most of us do is take this paper, take the reviewer's comments, and change the paper. We send it to another journal, usually a slightly lower tier journal. And very often it gets accepted. Like the fourth or fifth time you try it with a different journal, at some point you have to say, okay, this belongs in the round file and it's just not going to fly. Manuscripts can get rejected that are very, very good papers. Solomon Burson and Rosalind Yallow published a paper back in the 60s on radioimmunoassays, groundbreaking assay technology. And Rosalind Yallow later got the Nobel Prize for this work. Burson didn't because he died, right? And you have to be alive to get the prize. When Rosalind Yallow would give talks about whatever we're talking about, she would include the pictures of the rejection letters from Science, Nature, Clinical Chemistry, and down the line of all of the manuscripts or all of the journals who rejected her manuscript that later became a Nobel Prize winning paper. So just because you got rejected doesn't mean your paper stinks. It could be a bad set of reviewers. Maybe you didn't write it as well as you could have. So most of us just make the changes and try again. Now I want to point out one other thing, and I'm going to use endocrinology again. They would specifically state that they only take the top 20 or 25% of papers in their field. Does that mean if you're the top 28% of papers in the field, that your paper stinks and doesn't deserve publication? What it means is endocrinology is trying to artificially keep their scientific impact factor high, right? And so it may not be a bad paper at all. I had a paper that was rejected by endocrinology one time, and the editor gave me this long diatribe about the dangers of comparative research. I guess we were talking about comparative to rat, maybe. Well, after I got finished being annoyed, I rewrote it, sent it to another very good endocrine journal. It was accepted with minor revisions, and it's been cited more than any of my other papers that have been published in endocrinology. There was clearly a bias in there somewhere, but the paper wasn't a bad paper. Now, I do have a paper that was a bad paper, and I got a couple of them in the file somewhere. So sometimes they're just not good, right? Now, the last thing I want to tell you is sometimes when you get your reviews back, you look at them and you think, you know, I don't think I was treated fairly. This reviewer didn't treat me right, my paper is rejected, but I really want to be in that journal. It is possible that you can appeal to the editor that decision. If you're going to appeal that decision, you have to spell out why you think you were treated unfairly. Okay? Now, he then will give you, or may give you, the opportunity to resubmit your paper. And sometimes I've seen him say, you suggest reviewers, and I'll take some of your reviewers and some of my reviewers. You'll get a second review. It's not totally unbiased, because you'll probably get one of those other reviewers who rejected your paper. But at least you get another chance. It doesn't always work, but it is something you can try. Now, on the other hand, I got a paper one time that I rejected, and the guy wrote back and said, I want my paper reviewed again. And I wrote back and said, okay, cool, but what is it? There's some reason that you want it re-reviewed? Was there a problem? What's going on here? I never heard from him again, so I guess he was, I don't know. So, I've kind of gone through this fast, but the real part of this seminar is for you to ask me questions that are burning in the back of your head somewhere. So, and then some of you guys that look about my age can help me answer these, because you know as much about this as I do. But if any of you have any questions, I'd be glad to try to answer them. Yes, sir?
Why can't people fix the manuscript on the format of the journal?
I didn't hear.
Why can't people prepare a manuscript on the format of the journal for Mr. Study?
Why can't they? I have no clue. But they don't. I can't tell you the huge number of times I've gotten manuscripts that are just, it almost looks like they were rejected at another journal and sent to me and they didn't bother to change it. That's usually my guess. But in the case where I did that, is I pulled up my last paper from the journal and followed it and thought I knew what I was doing, but there was a new editor in and he had changed it and I didn't pay attention.
In other words, I've read in that course for a long time recently, and students can't prepare a paper on the format of the journal. Simply can't.
And you would think it would be easy to change the references now because you have these reference programs that'll automatically do it for you, but it doesn't happen.
So your statement is you can publish a paper on a RAT, but you can't publish the same paper on a sheet.
If it's already been published in a RAT.
Yeah.
So what it is I can't go to the RAT journal. I've got to go to a different type of journal. But
How much of that is a bias of your field of study?
it is, if these guys that do RAT research or human research, I would think it's a serious bias on their part.
Well, I mean, I'm looking at it from a different point of view. You're ignoring any phylogenetic context.
No, they will. The only way they will let something go, if a paper's been done in a rat, the fact that someone else does it in another species, they don't care about. And they'll say you can't publish it because it's already been done in a rat. They only want new biology. And that's peculiar. It's not necessarily peculiar in the biomedical arena. That's what you'll see a lot of. Now, if it's a species difference, so if a sheep does something fundamentally different than a rat, then that's okay. But if the sheep does it the same way, responds the same way as a rat, they look at it as if, well, that may be new for the sheep, but we don't care because we already know this. So we want to know the new biological process, not that it also happens in other species. And to be honest, one of the reasons I started domestic animal endocrinology is because we were doing veterinary and agricultural research, and you can spend months making something happen only to find out, well, the sheep did it the same way as the rat, and so there's still some value in that information. And so one of the reasons we did this was, we started this journal, was to have an avenue where good quality research could still be published even though part or all of it may have been done in a rat. Yes, sir. One of you, fight it out and I'll take it.
I'll go first.
Executive decisions there, huh?
This is a Not quite a rant, I think, but it's a serious complaint on my part. Because I remember the good old days when the titles of papers were, well, first of all, everybody in here should read the title of Charles Darwin's paper. Okay, so that's obfuscation, too many words, not to the point. Papers that started with on the effects of X as judged by, and so, 40 words. And by the time you read the title, you were asleep. And there is an unfortunate trend that continues, and it's completely deplorable, and that is to make titles that sound like MSNBC or CNN or one of those. Compound X causes white rats to turn black instantly before your eyes. Reported thousands of times on Twitter. And this nature does this, science does this. The journal Cell Biology is maybe the worst. Titles have now become, what can I say, headlines, which essentially say, this paper is really fantastic, and all you have to read is the title to know that. Because I'm telling you that I found really important stuff, and so I'm on top of the heap. I'm finished.
Okay.
What's your opinion about titles for all these young people?
You put me on the spot because you're taking the opposite point of view. No, and he hasn't either. I understand, and I don't disagree with you. But I think the tendency has become for the quick soundbite or the idea that sex sells, and a sexy title is going to sell papers. It is the genesis of it. I don't think that's necessary. But it still has to be something that will attract your attention out of a list of everybody else's who looks just like yours. And I think that's why people are trying different things, because you're going to have page after page of titles of which they're hoping that theirs will be the one that you stop and look at. So it's an understandable thing that's occurred with the ability to look at all the papers in the world published all at one time.
Well, to be fair, I could look at most of mine as paper reprints in my 5 file cabinets, too. I could have take up some space, but it's my opinion that it's a very unfortunate development.
Well, and it's also being driven by this bean counting mentality that we have these citation analyses and that they might mean something. And in some places they really do. When they use them that way, it drives it even further because you've got to get attention. And the reality is when I first started in, there were boatloads of comparative endocrinologists, and today the numbers are vanishing. They're not nearly so many, and so my earlier papers have really big citation rates compared to the things I've been doing more recently. And so if you're in a small field, the ability to get citations is much lower. Good question.
Yes, I wanted you to revisit the authorship because it's a real issue, and I know you went through it pretty quickly, but I'll give you an example of something that I experienced recently. Graduate students submit some manuscripts to me, and my first thing was, I don't recognize the rationale for this individual's name in the authors. So he's a doctoral student, so I asked him to justify if this, that, and the other. I later discovered from one of the technicians one of the reasons, one of the complicating factors is that the individuals were romantically involved. But my whole point is that there seems to be an explosion.
So sex really does sell, huh? I didn't say that. So.
It was also a reproductive put some endocrinology.
Adds a little humor to it.
Yeah. But my point really is the explosion of inclusion of people on manuscripts when they really have contributed, like you itemize some things, which I hold very dear to, is that have they contributed in some significant manner to the intellectual just because they're a paid individual who runs assays doesn't necessarily mean that they should automatically get on the paper. But if they are a paid person who runs assays, who may have found a better way to do that assay, or contributed something new that made that assay more efficient, more reliable, then I think they certainly made a scientific contribution to that endeavor. So I wonder if you could walk back a little bit and maybe.
Well, I think you just did it for us. But I mean, it's a critical issue of who deserves to be on the paper. And I do get annoyed when I see these labs where they publish a paper and everybody in the lab gets on there. And so you have people that really don't deserve that publication getting credit for it.
Well, it dilutes the merit of the paper to some degree. And also, you just get suspicious. I'm an administrator, so you get suspicious when it comes to promotion and tenure. And it's hard to differentiate or determine what is the intellectual value when that person is reporting these publications for their promotion and tenure, or just merit increase, whatever it is. There's some kind of credibility to it. Especially sometimes when you see there's 10,000 names in the paper, you just wonder exactly.
Well, a lot of these new center studies where they have multi-center grants and you have so many you can't even begin to look at it. I don't really know how they do those either, but it's like everybody in the grant gets on the paper. And it seems a little strange, but I don't know. It's almost like that discussion that we're having here needs to take place with graduate students and faculty, because it's not like we're sitting around saying, well, there's a moral imperative that you really earn your way onto this paper. It's just wide open, whatever the lab wants to do. And so I have used authorship to reward people. For instance, when I first went to Auburn, we had a statistical service. And I discovered that if I put the statistician's name on my paper, when I brought my data set in, my data set went to the top of the list, and people that weren't giving him anything in return, theirs goes to the bottom. So I had a reason for it. But his administrators were wanting to know, are you publishing? They didn't want him just sitting there doing statistics, even though that's what they hired him to do.
That's a good example. That's a complicated one, because if they contribute to the statistical modeling of your work, like not all of us are good, even if you took statistics as graduate students. But sometimes you have got some data sets that are very complicated, and the statistician helps you work it out and present the data in a meaningful manner that makes it scientifically relevant. Then I do believe in that instance that the statistician contributes scientifically to the intellectual knowledge.
Well, in my case, I'm a lousy statistician, so without him, my paper wouldn't have been as good. So I tongue-in-cheek say that I did it for my own advantage, but I felt like it was justified as well. And I also put my technician on there because I tell my technician, this is what I want done, figure out how to go do it, and she'll develop the assays and develop the techniques and validate them and everything. And so, as opposed to someone that buys the kits and runs a quick assay, I think there's a big difference there. So I've always put my technician on if she's, not always, but if she's contributed something major like developing the analysis. But it is a critical issue, and that's why I raised it, but I don't have a good answer for every situation. And I just think the students should begin to think about how do you decide what to do. In my son's department, he worked did his PhD at the University of Texas. And his boss, I think, is just now 80. And the story is that they'll find him dead in his chair one day and wheel him out because he's never going to quit. But he's very, very active. But his philosophy is the student doing the work, the major professor, and maybe if somebody stepped in and made a really major contribution. So you'll find no more than 3 people on any of his papers. And I was talking to Janet. Last time I looked, he had 800. So he's not fluffing anybody. You earn your way through the lab, right? And there's something majestic about it, I guess. But I don't have a pat answer for you as to where to make the cutoff or how to do it.
Awareness issue as well. We're talking to a broad audience. But it is troubling in some instances.
Yes, sir. And then you old guys can't ask any more questions. We're going to let the students ask. One last time.
I was wondering if you thought that your comment that make sure you cite the most recent papers
Well, it might be, but, you know, if that field is changing and our thoughts about that field change, then I think the most recent references add context that help with understanding the paper. If it's a very slowly moving field and there hasn't been, you know, this dramatic change, it might not be as big of an issue.
Well, I understand, and I agree with you, but it literally scares me. I've been retired for quite a while, but back when I was, you pick up a master's thesis or a dissertation, and you find the oldest reference, regardless of the field, is 1989. What's that amount to? That's about as back as far as Google goes.
Well, and that's true, but then the disservice comes from the faculty for not making sure the student understands the history that's led up to 1989. And there are some humorous papers I've reviewed over the years where somebody did it in 1965, but they've forgotten, and he did it with an old technique, but the results are still the same. Or there was this huge proliferation of studies of people injecting growth hormone, but they did that in the 1950s and 60s and put massive doses of growth hormone as a weight control mechanism, and they found they created skinny hyperthyroid animals or people, and it doesn't work. And so in late 1980s, we replicated all those old studies yet again. The only difference was it was a recombinant product instead of extracted. But so there is a lot of value in understanding what came before us. So students, this is your seminar. I'm supposed to be talking to you guys. Do you have any questions? Some of you are writing papers.
Yeah, with regard to revisions, I guess it might apply more to major revisions. I know you can't speak to other editors necessarily, but do you necessarily try to be consistent with, say you have to send it out for review, would you use the same reviewers, or do you tend to pick from a new batch of reviewers?
No, it goes back to the same. It always goes back to the same reviewer because they're the ones that made the criticism in the first place. They've already reviewed the paper. So you are in essence satisfying them that you've improved your manuscript. And then I look at it after that fact. So once you convince them that your paper is of a quality to go into the journal, then I go back and review everything again. But yeah, it'll go back to the same reviewer. The only time that I've seen it go to other reviewers is if they didn't have enough reviews in the pot and the two disagree, they may then go to a third reviewer to try to get some sort of majority rule decision.
I have seen reviews come back after a second round with a whole different host of problems, and they really care about their original problems. So
I've seen that too, and I've never quite understood why, but then that's the editor's purview, whether you look at those and go, by going through it again, did he uncover some things he didn't see the first time? And that happens. Or is he just a jerk? And I have to tell you, honestly, in my database, we had, and I shouldn't tell you this, but we had jerk written down sometimes. Because there are reviewers that are just mean. And so we would try to, once we found out they were really mean, we would put a little identifier in the file next to them and try not to use them. Unless it was a really, really bad paper and you knew it up front. And then you also had these reviewers that you knew would reject it. So you can do, so editors have a little bit of power that they can use. Yes, sir.
What would you say is an acceptable time frame for turnaround for the submission of your manuscript to where you receive the revisions to sending that back to finding out the final decision?
That is typically up to the journal in question, and they each have their own time frames. But we would typically give them, it's been a while, but I think what it was 45 days. You have 45 days or 30 days to respond, and after that point it becomes a new submission. So each journal should have its own rules and regulations at how long you can have. Because before people started putting in that date, they could stretch out for hundreds of days before these people would get them back. And then all of a sudden we're looking at one of the metrics you look at as an author is how long does it take my paper from the day I submit it until the day it's in press. And these people that are lazy and don't get their papers back, it stretches those numbers and it makes the journal look bad. So there's an attempt to constrain it within a limited amount of time. Plus reviewers tend to forget why they said things, and so you want to keep it fairly quickly. Yep. Not you, behind you. Just hold on. Let the students.
No, sir. I have a story I'd like to share. I'm not sure if I have a question at the end, but I'd like to put it anyway.
recently, we found out a postdoc, a husband, actually, postdoc in our lab. We went to the whole country, published a paper with a lot of PI. But the project is the original project that we initiated in our lab. So exactly in a way, he had committed IP theft, and that paper got accepted in a really good journal. Now, our PI, my PI, who started and appealed to that paper and asked him to withdraw that paper from the journal. And we had to, and that paper was, we hold up that paper, we push that paper because there's a piece of evidence that we provide to make the paper stronger in order to, tell it for a better journal. So now that paper was published in the field, and the data is really bad. He includes some data that's not real and it's poisonous.